The air in the palace tasted like old silver and lies. In the whole of France, this gilded prison was called Versailles, but to those who truly lived within its walls, it was just a stage where every heartbeat was a performance and every breath was a calculation. A king's power was measured in armies and gold, yet his deepest weakness was often measured in silk and secrets. This is not the story of a great queen or a triumphant war. This is the story of a forgotten whisper, the scandalous, true tale of Jeanne du Barry, a woman who dared to love the most powerful man in Europe and, in doing so, paid the steepest price for a momentary throne. What happens when a girl born in shadow steals the light from a king, and what happens to the king who becomes utterly consumed by her glow? Make sure to watch the video all the way till the end. I promise you're going to find it super informative. We put a lot of hard work into bringing you this content, so don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give the video a like, and share it with your friends. Your support helps the channel grow and motivates us to keep creating even better videos for you. The Paris rain had a way of washing the streets clean of mud, but never of sin. It was in one of the city's less loved corners, a place where the shadows were long and the whispers were louder than the bells, that Jeanne du Barry first understood that the world was rigged against her. She was the living, breathing consequence of a moment of passion, a beautiful mistake. Her mother, a woman of sharp wit but no fortune, had been seduced by a man who belonged to a world Jeanne could only glimpse through high, barred windows. The shame of her birth, the brand of being a natural child of an affair, was the first lesson life taught her. It was a silent, heavy cloak she wore every day, a constant reminder of the rigid social ladder she was forbidden to climb. But Jeanne was not a girl to simply accept a verdict. She had a mind that moved faster than any nobleman's carriage and an ambition as fierce as the winter wind. While other girls her age learned needlepoint and modesty, Jeanne devoured books, stolen, borrowed, or begged for. She learned the language of the court from dusty histories and practiced the art of conversation on unsuspecting merchants. She knew, deep in her heart, that her beauty was a key, but her intelligence was the true weapon. Her chance came not with a grand entrance, but with a quiet desperation. Through a twist of fate and the help of a distant, minor acquaintance, Jeanne found herself employed, a mere shadow in the household of a powerful duke. She was meant to be invisible, a handmaiden, a helper, someone who folded laundry and dusted porcelain. But Jeanne used her invisibility to observe. She watched the nobles eat, flirt, and plot. She saw how power moved, not in bold declarations, but in slight nods and whispers behind fans. The duke's estate was grand, but it was just a satellite of the true sun, Versailles. That legendary palace, with its hundreds of rooms and thousands of rules, was where King Louis XV resided, and it was the center of the universe. To Jeanne, Versailles was not a dream. It was a fortress she intended to breach. One evening, during a lavish country hunt hosted by the Duke, Jeanne was tasked with serving wine. She moved through the crowd, a vision of quiet grace, her dark eyes absorbing everything. The king, Louis XV, was present. He was known as the Beloved, but also as a man burdened by the immense, crushing formality of his life. He was a king who was tired of being a symbol and longed desperately to be just a man. As Jeanne passed, Louis was engaged in a painfully boring conversation about tax reform. He glanced up, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second. In that fleeting moment, something passed between them that was neither attraction nor duty, but surprise. Jeanne did not curtsy low or blush like the other women. She simply held his gaze, a sharp, intelligent challenge in her eyes, and moved on. She had broken the first rule of the court: never surprise the king. The next day, a small, unmarked carriage arrived for Jeanne du Barry. Her life in the shadows was over. She was being summoned to Versailles. Versailles was not a palace. It was a hungry, breathing creature made of gold, mirrors, and judgment. When Jeanne arrived, she was not paraded into the Hall of Mirrors. Instead, she was led through a maze of hidden corridors, back staircases, and servants' quarters, a sign that her presence was intended to be a secret, a temporary distraction rather than an official appearance. She was housed in a small, exquisite apartment near the king's private study. It was a golden cage, luxurious and silent. Servants, sworn to silence on pain of banishment, attended her every need, but no one spoke her name. She was known only as the guest. Jeanne quickly realized the immense power dynamics at play. She was no longer just the daughter of an affair. She was a political object, a piece in the king's dangerous game. The established royal mistresses, the women of high birth who saw their position as a right, would tear her apart if they discovered her rapid ascent. Every action, every request had to be carefully managed. Her first meeting with King Louis XV in this new, private setting was a masterclass in breaking protocol. Louis was tired of the formal greetings, the pre-planned compliments, and the endless stream of people demanding something from him. He entered her room looking not like a king, but like a man who hadn't slept in a week. "Tell me," Louis asked, dropping heavily into a silk chair, ignoring the proper ritual of having her wait for him to be seated first. "Tell me something that is not about the harvest, my cousin's gout, or the latest military blunder." Jeanne smiled, a genuine, unpracticed smile that reached her sharp eyes. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice low and steady, "I could tell you that the reason I was staring at you the other night was not out of admiration, but because you had a crumb of bread caught in your wig." The king stared at her. His face, usually set in the bored, weary mask of royalty, broke into an astonished, genuine laugh. It was a sound few in Versailles had heard in years. "A crumb?" he chuckled, reaching up to touch his immaculate powdered hair. "You mock the king?" "I only report the truth, Your Majesty," Jeanne replied, her tone respectful yet completely fearless. "And I believe a king who surrounds himself with only those who tell him pleasant lies is easily defeated by the one person who tells him a painful truth." This was the beginning of their relationship. It was not built on instant romance or overwhelming desire, but on banter sharp, witty, and entirely forbidden. Jeanne offered Louis something no one else could: sanity. She treated him like a man, not a monument. In Jeanne's private chamber, Louis could complain about the suffocating weight of his crown. He could confess his anxieties about the endless wars and the mounting debt. Jeanne listened, not with the calculating ear of a courtier, but with the sharp analysis of an outsider. She didn't offer advice on policy, but she offered a perspective, the perspective of the common people, the ones whose lives were crushed by the velvet boots of the nobility. The king began to crave this time. The public life of Versailles was a torture of endless rituals. The lever, the king's waking ceremony, the dinners, the hunts, all watched by hundreds of eyes. Jeanne's apartment became his hidden sanctuary, a place he could retreat to and be, briefly, Louis, not Louis XV. This arrangement was fragile. It was a secret wrapped in layers of secrecy, guarded by the king's absolute power. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the palace was hushed and the mirrors reflected only the shadows, Jeanne du Barry, the girl from the Paris streets, was closer to the king's ear than any duke or minister. Her power was growing, silently and dangerously, and the court was slowly beginning to sense that the king was becoming obsessed with his newest, secret favorite. The life Jeanne du Barry now led was a contradiction. Publicly obscure, privately influential. While she remained hidden from the formal court, She was, in many ways, at the absolute center of power. Every day, the rituals of Versailles flowed around her like a great, gilded river, and Jeanne sat on the bank, observing. She learned the customs that governed the lives of thousands. She watched, through a tiny, hidden grate in her wall, the king's formal dinner. It was a spectacle, not a meal. The king ate in silence, surrounded by the highest-ranking members of the court, all standing rigid and silent, their eyes fixed on him. If the king glanced at someone, it was a moment of immense, terrified honor. Jeanne saw the incredible formality that suffocated Louis, turning a simple dinner into a terrifying, holy event. She understood why he preferred to eat plain, simple food in her room, laughing at her terrible attempts to make a peasant stew. Jeanne understood that the king was not allowed to have a private life. His entire existence was a duty to the state, a living performance of royalty. When he came to her, he wasn't looking for a lover, though that soon developed. He was looking for a holiday from his own life. However, the shadows of the court were long, and the palace walls had eyes. Even the most carefully guarded secret at Versailles had a smell. The speed of Louis's renewed lightness, his sudden bursts of good humor, and his increasing retreats to his private study did not go unnoticed. The established favorites, particularly the aging and fiercely possessive Madame de Pompadour and her allies, began to hunt for the source of this change. They did not know her name, but they knew she existed. They pieced together the crumbs. An increased security detail on a certain wing, a small increase in the expense for unusual fabrics, a new, younger maid attending to the king's private needs who was never seen in public. The court, which lived and breathed on gossip and suspicion, was slowly constructing the image of the king's new obsession. Jeanne, despite her low birth, was remarkably sharp in the game of self-preservation. She knew her position was precarious. One wrong word, one moment of arrogance, and the powerful forces of the nobility would crush her like an insect. She deliberately kept her public profile neutral. When she was allowed, occasionally, to ride in the king's private carriage outside the palace grounds, she dressed simply and sat silently, pretending to be a low-ranking secretary or companion. When Louis insisted on giving her jewels, she accepted them, but wore them only when they were completely alone. She was building her power in private, refusing to flaunt it in public. But the most difficult struggle was within the walls of her own heart. She had come to the palace with ambition, a calculated move to escape poverty. But the king was not a cold, distant figure to her. He was a lonely, intelligent man who needed her. Jeanne found herself truly caring for Louis, a dangerous feeling in a place where love was a fatal weakness. Her struggle against societal norms had morphed into a struggle to reconcile her ambition with a terrifying, genuine affection for the king. One night, a minor court official who was secretly working for the Duke's faction attempted to deliver a threatening letter to her apartment. The official was intercepted by the king's private guard before he even reached her door. The next morning, the official was gone, sent away to a distant, miserable post on the edge of the kingdom. Louis XV, the beloved, had shown Jeanne a flash of the absolute, ruthless power that protected her. He was infatuated with her, and his obsession was now her shield. Jeanne realized her true power was not in her charm, but in the king's desperate need for her. As the weeks turned into months, Jeanne's influence solidified, moving from a playful distraction to a serious, if unofficial, power. Louis XV no longer just shared jokes and complaints with her. He began to ask her about people. He would describe a troublesome minister, an ineffective general, or a corrupt local administrator, and ask Jeanne what she thought. "You have the eyes of a peasant, Jeanne," he once told her, not as an insult, but as a deep compliment. You see the dirt on the boots, while my ministers only see the polish. Jeanne knew that one careless comment could ruin a man, or, conversely, lift a worthy one from obscurity. This was the true nature of power dynamics at the highest level. The right person whispering the right word at the right moment. She wielded this power with extraordinary caution. Unlike the greedy courtiers, she did not ask for titles or vast estates for herself. She asked for small, quiet things. A pension for an elderly soldier, a reprieve for a farmer unjustly taxed, the promotion of an honest, competent official who lacked the right family name. Her restraint baffled the king, and it was precisely that lack of self-serving greed that deepened his trust and infatuation. Louis, who was surrounded by vultures, found a dove in Jeanne. His response was grand and inescapable. The secret could not hold forever. The gossip was becoming too loud, too dangerous for the stability of the court. To protect Jeanne, and to formally declare his choice, Louis made a gesture that shocked Versailles to its core. He did not make her a duchess or a princess. Instead, he presented her with an official, legal document that designated her as the owner of a magnificent property near Versailles, the Château de Louveciennes, along with a generous income. More importantly, he gave her an official, though newly created, title: Comtesse du Barry, Countess du Barry. Jeanne Vernier, the girl of no name, was suddenly Madame la Comtesse du Barry. She was no longer just the guest hidden in the king's back chambers. She was a recognized figure, a noble in her own right with a place, however controversial, at court. The reaction was explosive. The noble families, whose lineage stretched back hundreds of years, were incandescent with rage. How could a woman born from a forbidden affair, a woman who had worked for a living, be given a title? They saw her as a stain on the crown, a sign that the king was losing his mind, sacrificing centuries of tradition for a pretty face. The most powerful opposition came from the king's own daughters, the formidable Mesdames, the king's unmarried sisters and daughters, and the faction led by the powerful and now deeply threatened Madame de Pompadour's remaining allies. They refused to acknowledge her, refusing to speak a single word to her or about her. Jeanne understood that this new title was not freedom. It was a more elaborate public cage. She was now highly visible, and the stakes of the game were raised exponentially. She had to learn the etiquette of her new rank instantly, or she would be swallowed by the sneers and slights of the old guard. Her first public appearance was a terrifying ordeal. Dressed in magnificent silk, draped in the jewels the king insisted upon, she walked into a formal reception. The silence was deafening, thicker than any noise. Every single person in the room, hundreds of nobles, refused to meet her eye, refused to bow, refused to speak. They had organized a silent boycott. Jeanne stood alone, a beautiful, powerful island in a sea of hostility. She held her head high, smiled calmly at the king, and waited. She had defied societal expectations to reach this point. She would not break now. The silent boycott launched against the Comtesse du Barry was not merely impoliteness. It was a devastating political weapon. In the rigid hierarchy of 18th century France, being ignored by the court meant you did not exist. The Mesdames and their faction believed that if they maintained their stony silence, the king would eventually become embarrassed by Jeanne and send her away. But they had underestimated both King Louis's obstinacy and Jeanne's remarkable resilience. The king, accustomed to everyone bowing to his will, was furious. His happiness, which he had finally found, was being sabotaged by his own family and his oldest courtiers. He began to apply pressure subtly at first. Titles were withheld, positions were revoked, and favors were denied to those who were the most open in their disdain for Jeanne. The war of wills continued for months. Jeanne, now permanently installed in her apartments at Versailles and officially recognized, handled the hostility with grace and a dangerous lack of panic. If a duchess refused to speak to her, Jeanne simply behaved as if the duchess was not present. If a noblewoman turned her back, Jeanne would engage the king in an even more animated and captivating discussion, reminding everyone present who held the true power in the room. Her greatest victory in this social warfare came during a New Year's reception. The tension in the room was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Louis, his patience worn thin, finally confronted the problem head-on. He walked over to his daughters, who stood rigid and forbidding, and asked them a seemingly innocent question. "What is your opinion on the matter of the new Turkish ambassador's wife? She appears to have such difficulty adapting to our customs." The oldest daughter, Princess Adelaide, launched into a detailed, if dry, account of the ambassador's wife's lack of manners. The king listened patiently, then turned to his youngest daughter, Victoire. "My dear Victoire," the king said, his voice dangerously soft, "you have not yet spoken to Madame la Comtesse du Barry. This silence is most peculiar. Do you find her so lacking in conversation that she frightens you?" The implication was clear. By refusing to speak to Jeanne, they were refusing to obey the king. Victoire stammered, trapped between her father's fury and her deep loyalty to the aristocratic boycott. She was forced to choose. With enormous effort, she turned to Jeanne and muttered, her voice shaking with humiliation and contempt, "Madame la Comtesse, there are many people at court who are curious about your humble beginnings. It was a terrible, intentional insult, a direct attack on Jeanne's status as the daughter of a forbidden affair." The entire room froze, waiting for Jeanne's tears, or perhaps for the king to banish his own daughter. Jeanne, however, simply smiled the cool, knowing smile that had first captured the king. "It is true, my princess," Jeanne replied, her voice ringing clearly through the silence. "I am certain that the nobility finds my beginnings curious. But you must understand, I am not a person of ancient blood, only a person of current power. Unlike those who inherited their status, I had to earn the king's attention every single day. And that, I believe, requires a talent that few in this room possess." The directness of her response, her willingness to openly claim her place through the king's personal favor, was stunning. It was a complete defiance of societal norms. The king roared with delighted laughter and immediately showered Jeanne with attention, effectively declaring her the winner of that exchange. From that moment on, the silence was broken. Small cracks appeared in the court's resistance. While many still hated her, they feared the king's wrath more. They realized Jeanne was not a passing fancy. She was a fixture, protected by the king's profound obsession. Jeanne had secured her place, but she knew the cost. Her every step was monitored, and her security rested solely on the king's beating heart. Jeanne du Barry, now fully established as the king's favorite, used her secure position to advocate for art, culture, and, most importantly, peace. She was known to be generous to the poor and a patron of thinkers, qualities that, while admirable, did little to win over the hard hearts of the aristocracy. She had succeeded in climbing the social hierarchy, but her high place only made her a clearer target. For a few golden years, Louis XV found true happiness. Jeanne's vivacious spirit and constant stream of amusing anecdotes lifted the oppressive boredom of his royal life. He grew deeply dependent on her, seeing her not just as a mistress, but as his closest confidant and his only true friend. She had managed to offer him a sense of peace amidst the chaos of court and the mounting political unrest in France, which was constantly murmured about but ignored by the nobles. However, in the world of absolute monarchy, one immutable truth holds: power is temporary and life is fragile. Jeanne's power was not rooted in her own family or land. It was rooted entirely in the king's health. In the spring of 1774, a shadow fell over Versailles. King Louis XV, while out on a hunt, contracted a terrible fever that rapidly worsened. The disease was quickly identified as smallpox, a deadly, unstoppable killer in the 18th century. The moment the physicians confirmed the diagnosis, the atmosphere at court changed from bored formality to terrified panic. The entire royal family and the court ministers gathered, not out of love, but out of a desperate need to secure their positions before the inevitable transfer of power. The Mesdames and the Jeanne du Barry faction saw their chance. Under the traditions of the French court, a king nearing death was required to confess his sins and receive the sacrament of the last rites. This ceremony was crucial as it required the king to publicly renounce his life of sin, which, in the eyes of the church and the nobility, meant renouncing his relationship with Jeanne du Barry. The pressure on the dying Louis XV was immense. The powerful Bishop of Senez was brought to the king's bedside. The message was delivered with ruthless clarity. If Louis wished to die in the grace of God and secure his place in heaven, he must banish the Comtesse du Barry from the palace immediately. This was the final, devastating act of the power dynamics at Versailles. Jeanne's life had been designed by Louis's affection, but it was being dismantled by religious and royal duty. Jeanne, who had genuinely loved the king, did not fight. She knew the ancient rules. To fight would be to deny Louis his peace in death, and she could not bear to do that to the man who had given her everything. In a heartbreaking moment, Louis XV, weak and consumed by fever, gave his final order. Jeanne du Barry must leave Versailles. She left in the dead of night, slipping away in a simple carriage, just as she had arrived years earlier. She did not take her jewels or her magnificent gowns. She took only a few personal possessions and the silent knowledge of the king's deep sorrow at her departure. The servants and guards who escorted her were tearful, knowing they were witnessing the end of a golden era. A few days later, King Louis XV died. The moment the king's death was announced, Jeanne's world collapsed. Her protector was gone. The new king, Louis XVI, and his young, beautiful, and pious wife, Marie Antoinette, despised everything Jeanne represented. They were the champions of the noble faction and immediately ordered Jeanne's permanent banishment from court. Jeanne was sent to the Abbey of Ponte-aux-Dames, a quiet, secluded place. She was no longer the Comtesse du Barry, the king's obsession, but simply a fallen favorite, isolated and forgotten. The journey from the gilded, terrifying heights of Versailles to the silent, stone walls of the Abbey represented the final, tragic cost of her defiance. She had broken the social rules, she had stolen the king's heart, and she had experienced a brief, brilliant moment of unmatched power. But in the end, the rigid structure of 18th century French society had exacted its price: solitude and silence. Her powerful, short, and scandalous life proved that while a woman of intelligence and charm could break through the velvet ropes of aristocracy, she could never truly escape the iron cage of royal duty and tradition.